All right, listener, tonight we're diving into something a little different. Seems someone out there loves their scary stories, and well, who are we to deny a good scare every now and then? You requested a deep dive into English horror stories, so let's see what we've got.
It never ceases to fascinate me how fear, this primal emotion, finds its outlet in storytelling across cultures.
Hmm.
But English horror, that's a particular flavor, wouldn't you say? There's a certain history, a certain weight to it.
Absolutely. And
Mm,
our source tonight, they really set the stage. They talk about how horror shines a light on the fears we try to hide, even from ourselves. Like they even mention those universal triggers, doors slamming shut in the middle of the night,
right.
whispers when you know you're all alone.
Oh, yeah.
That feeling of footsteps, even when you know there shouldn't be anyone else around, it's primal.
You hit the nail on the head. Those are such classic examples of tapping into that fear of the unknown, that unseen presence. But what sets English horror apart is how those fears, those universal fears, are all tangled up with this uniquely English sensibility. Take the first story, for instance, the antique doll.
Ooh, the creepy doll. A classic for a reason, right? Our listener will get to experience the whole story a bit later, but just to give you a taste, it features an antique doll,
Mm.
arrives with a note. I'm waiting for you. I mean, come on. Already creepy. And of course, it doesn't stop there. Doors start slamming. There are whispers following the main character, Mary. And this palpable tension just builds and builds. You're on the edge of your seat waiting for the other shoe to drop.
See, and that's where the brilliance of the doll trope, especially in English horror, really shines. It taps into this unsettling idea, corrupting something innocent, something familiar, something seemingly harmless, and twisting it into something, well, menacing. Think about traditional English folklore everyday objects, cursed, imbued with evil spirits, and that's what permeates English horror. That underlying unease, the fear of what hides beneath the surface.
Like even the most ordinary things, a teacup, a rocking chair, a child's toy, could be hiding something sinister. Speaking of atmosphere, our source describes the next story setting as a deserted forest. And anyone who's even dipped their toes into English horror knows a forest is never just a forest.
Oh, absolutely. The English landscape, especially those ancient forests steeped in history, they become a character in their own right. It's like the landscape itself is layered with centuries of stories of history. You've got ancient ruins being swallowed by these woods, whispering tales of forgotten times. And then you have these remnants of industrial progress slowly being reclaimed by nature. And it all creates this palpable sense of unease, this feeling that something ancient, something unknowable is watching you from the shadows.
Right, it's like you're waiting for some figure out of Arthurian legend to step out from behind a tree.
It's so different from, say, American horror with those vast, untamed wildernesses.
Mhm.
English horror, it thrives on that feeling of claustrophobia, of being watched, of being surrounded by something that's both beautiful and unsettling at the same time.
Okay, I could already feel the chills.
Which brings us to the next tale, which takes place in one of these very forests. So listener, just picture this. You're walking through this deserted forest, and the only sound is the crunch of leaves beneath your feet. Shadows stretch out almost like skeletal fingers, and the air gets heavy, like you can feel unseen eyes on you.
And that brings us to another hallmark of English horror. It's not always about the jump scares, the gore. It's the slow burn, that creeping dread, the psychological fear of an unseen threat, the feeling that something is wrong, deeply wrong, but you don't know what it is or when it might strike. It's what you don't see, what you can't explain that really gets under your skin.
Yeah, it's that anticipation, that waiting for something to happen that really gets you.
Exactly. It's like a masterclass in suspense, using the atmosphere, the suggestion to really get under your skin. And that brings us back to our story of story. You're alone in these woods. You can feel those unseen eyes on you, and that's when you hear it. A whisper, just barely audible, but close enough to make your skin crawl. You shouldn't be here. See, that's what I love about good horror. It doesn't spell everything out for you. It lets your imagination fill in the blanks.
Oh, absolutely. It lets your own fears become part of the story. And speaking of fears taking shape, that brings us to the last story from our source tonight. And they claim this one is the most terrifying of them all. The Whisper Man.
Ooh. Even the name is creepy. There's something about a whisper, right? It's like a secret, but it's invading your thoughts.
Exactly. And this story plays on that feeling of dread. Our source describes this figure, the Whisper Man, who is terrorizing a small town, and he's got this calling card. He whispers your name, and once you hear it, well, let's just say things take a dark turn.
It's like he can see right through you, knows what scares you most, and uses it against you. That personalized terror, that's what makes this story so effective.
You're right to highlight that personalization. The story uses those classic tropes we've been talking about, but adding the name, it adds this other level of creepiness, like a primal fear, being singled out, hunted by something that knows you better than you know yourself. And it's something we see a lot in English urban legends, right? Which England has a ton of.
Oh, for sure. You've got Spring-Heeled Jack, Jack the Ripper, even Black Shuck, that demonic dog that supposedly haunts East Anglia. Those stories get stuck in our heads because they play on those fears that pop up when you're in a populated place.
Right. Think about being in a crowded city and you just feel like you're being watched, followed. Urban legends, they give a name, a face to that unease. But then you add in the name element, that personal touch.
Mhm.
It's almost like a curse that's just for you.
It makes it personal in the creepiest way possible. So, to kind of recap our trip into English horror tonight, we've got a creepy doll with a nasty streak, a haunted forest full of history, and this terrifying whisper man who preys on your deepest fears. Safe to say our source delivered on the scary stories, don't you think?
They did. But like we always do in our deep dives, let's go a little deeper, past the surface chills. What do these stories tell us about English horror as a whole? We've got three very different tales, each with their own brand of fear, but what connects them? What makes them specifically English horror?
Well, one thing that jumps out is atmosphere. Every single story, whether it's the slow burn of the antique doll or that heavy feeling you get with the haunted forest, they all build tension, pull you in, and make you feel like you're right there with the characters.
And that's a huge part of English horror, right? It relies on that psychological terror, on what's suggested rather than just showing you something gruesome. It's about what you don't see, the things left unsaid that really stick with you.
It's like you're left to face those fears in your own head. And we can't forget about the setting, how each story uses that distinctly English landscape, full of history and folklore. It adds a whole other level to the horror, don't you think?
Exactly. Think about those old ruins we talked about earlier, swallowed up by the woods, or even those foggy streets you get in Victorian London stories. Those settings, they're practically characters themselves. They have this weight of history, like past events are still echoing there.
Yes.
It's almost like the land itself remembers things. And some of those memories, they're pretty dark.
Makes you wonder, what other stories are hidden under those pretty villages and those rolling hills?
Ooh, now that's a chilling thought, isn't it? That something that looks peaceful on the surface could be hiding something scary underneath.
For sure. So, listener, we've spent some time with English horror tonight, looking at what makes it unique, what makes it so unsettling. What do you think? Which one stuck with you the most? Were you more drawn to that corrupted innocence of the antique doll, the heavy atmosphere of the haunted forest, or that bone-chilling feeling of the Whisper Man knowing your name?
Here's something to think about as we wrap things up. Our source mentioned they had even more scary stories to share. So we're turning it over to you, listener. What kind of story would you tell? If you had to come up with an English horror story, what would make it scary? Would you use those classic elements we've been discussing, find the horror in those old historical places, or maybe come up with something totally unique to you, something based on your own fears? We'll leave you with that thought to ponder.